Welcome to EFI in Conversation. I'm Matt Nielsen. I'm the board chair at the Educational Freedom Institute, and I'm joined today by Dr. Angela Dills and Dr. Corey DeAngelis. Dr. Dills serves on EFI's advisory board. She's a professor of economics at Western Carolina University, where she teaches economics of labor markets and introductory microeconomics and social issues. She's also the Gimelstob Landry Distinguished Professor for Regional Economic Development. Dr. DeAngelis serves as EFI's Executive Director. He's also the Director of School Choice at the Reason Foundation and Adjunct Scholar at the Cato Institute. So, with those introductions, we want to talk a little about how policy is being shaped by the current events, the world events, surrounding coronavirus, the pandemic that we're all experiencing right now, and what that could also mean for the future of school choice. So to start, I want to just pose a question, and we'll go with that for as long as we can, and as long as you're both interested in pursuing it. But it revolves really around how policy is being shaped in Pennsylvania, Oregon, and elsewhere, where they've prohibited enrollment in virtual schools, and with some even more current news, potentially advocating for enrollment in anything other than a government school. So I'm just going to start, if I can. Corey, why don't you tell us what's going on in those two states and elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing a lot of tweeting on Pennsylvania and Oregon and what's going on, because it's actually quite shocking. I mean, look, this is a time of our lives where a lot of kids are struggling to get an education right now, because a lot of the almost all of the brick and mortar schools in the United States are closed right now. I think the most recent estimate from Education Week was over 97% of schools are closed for students, affecting over 50 million children that are of school age of the school age population. So it's affecting a lot of people, and a lot of district-run schools are adjusting, and they're trying really hard to adjust to a virtual environment, and I commend them for that. But not all of them are doing an excellent job, and for some segment of the population, they're seeing that a virtual charter school is a good option for them, because look, the virtual charter schools are essentially uninterrupted during this crisis, because they were already doing things virtually for their customers and for families and students. So I think the whole world is kind of looking at the homeschooling population and looking to them for how to improve their own lives and their own kids' educations, and they're looking towards the virtual schools. But a couple of states are actually using the power of the government to prevent students from switching out of their government school enrollments to the virtual school enrollments. And by the way, before either of these states took action, it would have been a-okay for students to switch from a brick and mortar school to a virtual school. It's just that there's new legislation that's being enacted to prevent kids from doing it just during the crisis, at the time when they need to be able to have these options the most. So in Pennsylvania, so Governor Wolf on March 13th ordered all public schools to close, including virtual charter schools, because they are public schools as well by definition in Pennsylvania and in other states. So they closed all schools, even though they were fine and giving kids educations virtually. But then it was technically the virtual schools were technically still allowed to provide educational services to the kids until and it still is today in Pennsylvania, even though they're officially closed. But the governor has a bill on his desk right now that was unanimously passed by the Senate and the House in Pennsylvania, and he's probably going to sign it either today or tomorrow, that freezes enrollment for charter schools in the state as of March 13th, when he made the first order to close all schools. So what that means in practice is that if students switch from district schools to virtual schools during this time, they can do that. That's okay. But the charter schools won't be compensated for those services for those additional students. So that's pretty bad in Pennsylvania. It's essentially financially punishing charter schools for doing the right thing in the time of the crisis. So it's because they still have to undergo the cost of educating those children, but they don't get any financial benefits for doing so. In Oregon, looks like I'm having connectivity issues. Hey, okay, I'm still with you. So in Oregon, it's similar, and I'll try to wrap this up in a second, but in Oregon, it's similar, but they aren't just not allowing the money to follow the child. What they're doing instead is the governor said, or the Department of Education most recently said that virtual schools cannot take any additional enrollments. So they can provide some services to kids who are already enrolled in their schools, but they cannot take additional enrollments. So these are just 2 states which are actively have groups in them lobbying to prevent kids from switching from the district school system to the charter school system, which, that makes sense from a competitive standpoint, I guess, if you don't want your customers to leave, but it looks really bad. It looks opportunistic, and it would be akin to, having in-person restaurants closed down in your state, and then those in-person restaurants lobby to make carry-out services illegal. That's essentially what this is, and that would look really bad in the restaurant industry. We would all think that would be ridiculous, yet that's what's happening in places like Pennsylvania and Oregon today. Angela, do you have any takeaways?
Well, I mean, I think I like your analogy a lot. It's a great analogy. And I think in some ways, the public schools, absent the funding question, should welcome some reduction in their enrollment at this point, right? I mean, it's a lot easier for them to provide services to fewer students, particularly if the ones who really need the online, the virtual education that the virtual charter schools can provide at relatively low cost. Why not shift some of those students over there where their demands can be met, and let the other students, stay in the public schools where, those public school teachers who are dealing with a lot, like all of us are, would have fewer students to work with. And that, you would think there's some benefits there too to the public school teachers, and having, some of their students, or in particular, some of their most demanding students who are really looking for a lot more resources than maybe a traditional public school can ramp up that quickly, having some of those students shift sectors.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And then, I mean, I've seen in other states as well that there's been cross-pollination between sectors where they're actually working together. So Matthew might know a little bit more about what's going on in Arizona, but I saw that I think the company was called StrongMind and they're associated with one of the big virtual charter schools in Arizona, but they're allowing the district schools to use their curriculum and courses for certain grade levels for free during the crisis. So, I mean, it doesn't have to look like cutthroat competition. It could still be a lot of, working together. And, maybe that's beneficial for the charter school operator to do from a long-term perspective, because look, it's goodwill, that's beneficial for your company. And also it could incentivize kids to switch sectors in the long run. So like the profit motive in education right now, a lot of people, it usually gets a bad rap, right? But like this is showing that the profit motive can actually give you an incentive to do a good thing. Yes. When there's a crisis like this, by even helping your competitors in the short run.
That's a great point.
Yeah, so I'll just make a quick comment on that. Here in Arizona, I'm not sure about other states, but here in Arizona, 2 legislators, one representative and one state senator, got together and said, hey, let's create some legislation, some emergency legislation, which is now passed, by the way, both chambers, and it's on the governor's desk for a signature, just waiting, that in one section of it actually says that traditional district schools can and should work with outside vendors, private companies in order to provide those services. And so that's a great example. StrongMind, that's right. You got that name right, StrongMind. They offered their services for free. There's another virtual charter school that's operating out of Tucson that did the same. And they just said, hey, if we have a platform, it works well, you're welcome to come. Anybody can come and use it for free. And by the way, they weren't offering this directly to district school students. They didn't target them. They targeted district school administrators and said, you can use our platform for your students. They don't have to come and enroll. So that's one of those goodwill things that you're talking about, Corey, that, you know, where it can actually encourage the right kind of behavior, what we would all say is the right kind of behavior, right? So nice.
Yeah, just another point on what Angela was saying about how reducing student load during a crisis and allowing for, you know, more flexibility and adaptation by reducing your student load could be a good thing for schools in general, in both sectors, and primarily the sector that has more students at the moment. But I think, you know, another point to look at is, you know, are we looking at the perspective of the schools and the teachers, or the teachers unions? And I think a lot of the pushback is coming from teachers unions, which is a little different, because look, even if that benefits your union members in the short run by reducing their class sizes, that could financially harm the teachers union in general by reducing union members perhaps in the long run, but then also just political power in numbers. So like if you look at like Pennsylvania, I tweeted the other day, one of the union leaders out there said in an email, this was a private email, so I'm not going to share the name of the union leader. I don't know their name either. This was shared by Commonwealth Foundation. But they said, there are so many things that your union is doing for you right now. One of the things being, how can we prevent mass numbers of students from enrolling in cyber schools? So they literally said the things that we were all kind of thinking beforehand about why this type of legislation would be happening. They said out loud that we're doing it to protect our monopoly, essentially. We're trying to prevent mass numbers of students from enrolling in cyber schools. And then I sent you guys a little bit earlier, right before the call, that Los Angeles Teachers Union president called today to ban all new charter schools as well. And they cited the coronavirus as the reason for doing so. I didn't think his argument was very strong, but they're explicit. Some of these people are explicitly saying, you know, because of the virus, we can't have more students going to the other sector, and this is why we want to do X, Y, or Z.
Don't let a good crisis go to waste, Corey.
Yeah, I know.
The opportunity to protect yourself from competition.
I mean, we're seeing that everywhere, and I mean, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good. I mean, what we should be focusing on is, look, a lot of people are in trouble right now because, look, a lot of people are losing their jobs, or they're just out of work and not getting as much money, you know, from their employers, and so employment's going up. And at the same time, families are having to deal with additional childcare costs. So Angela, you might want to talk a little bit about that. But like what we should be focusing on is how we should be helping all families, regardless of the sector. I don't care what sector does it, but all sectors should be trying to provide as much as possible for families at the moment. And so Angela, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of those adjustments?
Sure, but before I do, I wanted to add one more example to kind of for-profit firms that are, you know, being charitable, sort of going out of their way during this. And at least in higher ed, I assume the same thing's happening in K-12. The textbook publishers have been really open with providing, like my students don't typically, what they're paying for isn't access to an ebook, but they were able, the publishers gave them access to the ebook. They gave them access to the homework materials that typically they would have to pay for. So a lot of the textbook publishers have really stepped up too in terms of providing more access to online materials for students. So I just want to put that out there because they frequently get a bad rap because there's a lot of money in textbooks.
Yeah.
So, right. So children, right. So I have 3 kids. They're in kindergarten, 4th and 7th. My husband and I are both professors. So unlike a lot of families, we're really fortunate in that, like, we're both home. We both still have our income from our jobs. We're both still trying to do our jobs at home while taking care of kids. So there's a lot of juggling going on. There's a lot of juggling on a regular basis, but it's a little bit magnified now. So I can only imagine like the added stress for families who are also dealing with job loss or income loss on top of having to deal with the childcare, additional childcare, and trying to, get your kids to do homework when they're also struggling with everything that's going on. So.
Yeah, I also did notice, another big part of the conversation right now has been about food costs for low-income families. So, a lot of these students were getting breakfast and lunch at school, and now the families are having to take on those additional costs as well. But I think the Department of Education or Congress passed a bill allowing those national school lunch program regulations to be waived and to allow, like school buses to go around and deliver food to different houses.
That's what happens in our neighborhood. About 11:30 or so, the school bus comes by. Our neighbor has 2 little girls, and I can hear the bus honk its horn and drop the lunch off. And so the school buses are still running midday, their regular route and dropping off lunches here in our county to the public school students. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's some guidance that came from, from a couple of places. It came from the Department of Ed, but also I believe that summer lunch program is what they've decided to kind of extend or pull, now back into March in order to take care of that. And I believe that that's administrated through the Department of Agriculture, but yeah, that's all that interplay from all these different agencies that are trying to work together to make sure kids have food and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So, Angela, just going back a little bit to this Pennsylvania, Oregon, and the reticence on the part of some of these states and groups to provide education. Can you talk a little about what you've seen with IDEA and requests to waive requirements there for FAPE and so on and so forth?
Yeah, so some of the issues with FAPE and with IDEA are I think challenging. Both sort of, if I think about what's happening in the household level with parents who are dealing with their kids who have special needs, but also sort of how school districts initially want to respond to it. I think, it's not, one of the arguments that I think that's being made is, well, if we can't provide the services to everybody, then we can't provide them to anybody. And it may be particularly challenging to satisfy a student's IEP with a virtual environment, particularly with some higher needs students. So I think a lot of the discussion is sort of along this line, right? So can we continue to provide educational services if we can only do it to some fraction of the student body? And I hate to make the analogy, but we get the same thing in our mountain town in the winter when it snows. There's some people who live at the top of the mountain and can't get in for weeks on end because there's some ice. But they want to close the school down for everybody because a couple families can't make it to school. And maybe in a similar way, the argument is being made here. If we can't provide, should we shut down shut down school for everybody if we can't provide services for those higher needs students? And yeah, so it's an argument that really frustrates me, right? We should be educating as many children as we can with the resources we have. It's a challenging time. It is very similar to the virtual charter school argument as well, right? Here we have people who have capacity, who can sort of expand and educate more children, but there's a lot of unwillingness from the traditional public schools, from the brick and mortar public schools, to allow them to shift. With our kids on IEPs, our students on IEPs, how are we? I was reading the Department of Education guidelines before we got on this call. It's like we just got to do the best we can, right, with what we have, and it probably isn't going to be enough for some of the students, but we've still got. I mean, I think educators still need to try to educate the students to the best of their ability, given our limitations.
Yeah, just working off of that. There was a couple of examples of specific school districts and states that were citing IDEA as a reason to not provide education to any kids. And so like Seattle was saying, I think one of the quotes was something along the lines of, treat this closure as if your kids were going on spring break. So like essentially like just flat out saying, there will be no online learning because, and they did cite the reason being that, there will be some students who don't have access to internet. So, and we don't know the percentage of those students, but, treat this as if it's spring break was the money quote from that. And then Oklahoma's director of communications at their Department of Education said, the inclusion of virtual charters in the shutdown order was due in part to assorted regulations, including requirements for students on IEPs. So they're citing again IDEA as a reason, or as essentially, a reason not to provide any education and to not allow virtual charters to keep providing educational services. And I will, point out that as public schools, charter schools are required to follow IDEA already. So I don't see how this should be an issue at all. And then the Department of Education, after hearing all of these particular groups, citing IDEA as a reason not to provide any services, the Department of Ed, to their credit, actually came out with guidance saying, look, this shouldn't be, there shouldn't be any excuse to not provide students educational or distance learning during the crisis. You should be trying to provide all students with educational services, IDEA, special needs students or not. You should be providing it for everybody. So I good thing on, good on Betsy DeVos. She actually tweeted about it too. And she was like, this is totally ridiculous. Everybody should be, educating the kids to the best of their abilities. So that's one good thing that the Department of Ed did during the crisis, that, without using a heavy hand, they provided clarification about, and then also waiving regulations relating to the federal lunch program, I think was a good move as well.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful.
Yeah, so a couple of wrap-up questions here before we end, or as we're closing in on 30 minutes. I want to kind of combine two that we had outlined here together and ask them together. So the first of the two would be, what difference in incentives are there between sectors to make sure that the response is right, that they get the response right? So that's the first part. And then the second, that I think actually these two go well together, because I think there could be some cause and effect here. But how will families, do you see, looking out into the future, a year from now, 2 years from now, maybe even 3 months from now, I don't know, how do you think families' perspectives on alternative methods of education will change based on what we're experiencing right now? So Angela, why don't you go ahead, take those two pieces.
Yeah, so the first on how it affects different sectors. So I'll preface this by saying my kids go to a private school, and in conversation with some of their classmates' parents, certainly part of the challenge and sort of making that transition that the kids' school has made is that the public school moved faster than they did because we were on spring break. And so the public school got a little jump on them compared to where our teachers were on vacation and on break. And so they came back and had a little time to prep and then transition. But, there's a strong pressure from parents who are paying more money out of pocket for private school, for those private schools to make sure they get it right. The timing's a little bit awkward, I'm going to guess, for a lot of private schools, because we're in the middle of, we've already signed contracts for next year. We've already committed our kids to go to school next year. And depending on how firm those schools want to be about enforcing those contracts, there may be a lot of lag in kind of how we see, any negative response if the school doesn't handle it that well. But I think in general, the more that the money is following the student, the stronger the pressure the school has to respond well. Because if you lose money when you lose a student, then you need to there's a cost to you getting it wrong, right? And so private schools clearly lose their tuition dollars when students choose not to re-enroll or fail to show up the next year. Charter schools, similarly have that kind of pressure. A lot of them are trying to increase their enrollment, maintain their enrollment so they can keep their funding. And in many cases, the public schools face much less of that financial repercussion for losing students. They face some, but that also differs a lot from state to state. So I'd be interested to see how that happens in different states, depending on how what the financial incentives are for the schools to maintain their enrollment.
And even
yeah, go ahead.
Even with that 1 year lag with the contracts that you pointed out, I mean, there's still an incentive for the school to do it right because, after that year contract's up, you can switch schools. And, even if that's the last year of school for your child, you can still influence the rest of society by saying, oh, look at this, look at what they did. They took advantage of us during this time of need. Right. They didn't help us. And you could give them negative reviews on Google and great schools, and that could affect them in the long term. And that's not something that they want to do. So they have every incentive to do the right thing and to help you guys in time of need, even if they're just being, profit driven, even if their incentives, even if their motives aren't the purists, even if they're not just really trying to help people, if they're just trying to seek long-term, financial benefit, they still have a stronger incentive to actually get things right. So I think that's important. But Matthew's second question is really important for school choice, I think, in the long run, because look, whether we like it or not, the U.S. population, school age population, essentially transitioned from being 2 to 3% homeschooling to almost 100% homeschooling. A lot of people, the homeschool crowd gets upset when I say this because they'll be like, oh, it's not actual homeschooling if it's virtual charters, but whatever you want to call it, the kids are at home and they're being educated at home, whether that's in a virtual charter setting or through the private school virtually. It's still essentially a home education environment. And a lot of people might not like it, and that's just the reality. They may say, oh, no, right when things get back to normal, I'm going to put my kids back into the brick and mortar school for whatever reason. But there will probably be a lot of parents who otherwise wouldn't have understood that, hey, I can actually do this. My kids can actually learn a lot from home without actually being in a brick and mortar school. And look, people may discover, homeschool co-ops where I can still go to work and then send my kid to this homeschool co-op group or micro school and, figure it out that way. But I think the big issue for the long run, even if a lot of families decide that they want to go this route, they may not be able to do so financially. And I think that's where ESAs come in. Education savings accounts where the money just follows the child and the family can use those education savings account dollars for home education costs or virtual education costs or childcare expenses associated with homeschooling. I think that's this really highlights the need for ESAs in that way, because look, a lot of families may want to do it and they may want to switch, but they just won't be able to financially.
I'm going to add a couple of things about homeschooling. One is that, there's some wonderful online groups of homeschooling parents who've been really generous with sharing resources as people have transitioned. So, kudos to the homeschooling communities for being so welcoming and sharing their knowledge and experience. And, I like having my kids at home. I think we have a lot more relaxed time to, bond and be a family than we maybe always do during the school year. But I imagine if we were homeschooling, we could do a whole lot more fun things than we can do right now. There's
right.
Something saying like
Social
10%
distancing.
of the kids in this area are homeschooled, and there's lots of there's lots of organizations and places in town that offer classes and other activities specifically for homeschoolers that we can't take advantage of during this time of quarantine. And so it's got to be even better than what we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, we're seeing a lower bound of the true benefits of homeschooling.
Yes.
So if you think you like it now, just wait.
Right.
Yeah,
Well,
that makes total sense, especially with sports and stuff. Like community
Exactly.
club sports, and like don't you have kids playing soccer right now? What has anything happened with that?
It's canceled for the season.
Canceled, yeah.
That the state organization canceled it. So. But we have local gyms that have gym classes, music classes, all kinds of stuff that happens during the school day for homeschoolers.
Have you seen that that online group Learn Everywhere on Facebook?
Yes.
They came out of nowhere during the crisis, and it looks to be like a lot of homeschooling, parents sharing a lot of resources like you're saying. And I think like when I first saw the group, there was like maybe 1,000 people in it. Now there's like over 10,000 people in the group, and people are sharing tons of resources. So if anybody's listening right now, just go to Learn Everywhere on Facebook or learneverywhere.org, and you can get a lot of those resources. And I was amazed at how many people came together to share this type of information. Then obviously, if Khan Academy is another outlet as well. But I thought it was really interesting how people spontaneously came together to share these resources in time of need.
But I'm not going to lie, some ESAs could be particularly valuable. There's a lot of random costs to having your kids home. Like our printer didn't work. We need toner to print materials. Just little things that you might not even think of as costs that are additional to having your kids home and trying to get the work done. So I'll echo your sentiment of supporting any ESAs.
Yeah, and I mean, we don't have to do it now, right? I mean, like, look, nothing's going to happen in state legislatures on the ESA front right now, and maybe it's not the time to even be, arguing for those things right now. But in the future, after this all blows over, if people figure they like this environment, they should be able to take their child's education dollars to the government-run school if they want. People should still have that option, but they should also be able to take some of that money to cover homeschool expenses or private school expenses, or they should be able to take it to a charter school as well. And maybe in order to get it politically feasible, maybe it's even just half of what you would have gotten in the traditional system. I mean, we spend over $15,000 a year in the U.S. per child in the most recent year of data by NCES. So like maybe we give families, $10,000 and let them do what they want with it, and then save the district schools that extra $5,000 for not having to educate the kid anymore. I mean, that should be a win-win. So
I will say one parting note just from what I've seen. I do think that the longer this goes on, where families are having to keep their kids home and educate them, and the more resources they get from places like Learn Everywhere and from neighbors maybe that they know that homeschool their kids, I think the longer that goes on, the more you're going to see people open up to the idea that, hey, maybe I could do this. Maybe this isn't out of my league, or I like it, because there is I think that's a big part of what's held people back, is just either a lack of confidence in themselves, that I couldn't do that. This is a professional type situation, where a teacher that has all the training needs to handle that. I'll just speak for myself. I know I've seen that with my own kids already. My first grader is, within a week, he's reading better, he's sounding out words better with the one-on-one instruction than he ever had before, and he has a great teacher. So it's not that he was put in a bad environment in the charter school that he goes to. That's not it at all. I think every kid is different, every kid is unique, they have their own needs, and that one-on-one instruction is really what's helped him. So I think the longer this goes on, I think the more you're going to see families open up to the idea that maybe the government-run school isn't the only option for every one of my kids.
Well, and we're also seeing the other side of that too right now, right? We're seeing groups start conferences and put together conferences to regulate the crap out of homeschooling and to even ban homeschooling. So Harvard Law School is co-sponsoring an event in June, for example. And if you just look through their panelists, I don't see any, you know, pro homeschooling people represented or their views. And if you just look at the titles, like it's talking, you know, it implies that they're talking about perhaps banning homeschooling altogether or just regulating it for the greater good. And they're citing like democratic values and socialization and stuff.
That's an air quote.
So, I mean,
the greater good.
yeah, I mean, the greater.
This.
So, I mean, groups need to be, I'm with you, Matthew, that people are, you know, are going to consider homeschooling more seriously because of this, but at the same time, because people are considering homeschooling more seriously because of this, you have people from the other side that might try to regulate homeschooling out of existence. I mean,
it becomes a threat. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, schools are based on enrollment counts, and if you reduce enrollment by switching into the homeschooling sector, that reduces, you know, education funding in the traditional system. So that's just something to look out for. I mean, we're not seeing a ton of that right now, but that is something I shared on Twitter recently, that Harvard's actually hosting a conference all about, you know, homeschooling and mostly negative things, it looks like, about homeschooling, but that I don't agree with, by the way.
Right. Okay. Well, any parting comments from Angela?
Thank you. This is great. Appreciate you organizing it, Matthew.
Oh, my pleasure. It was great to have you on, Angela. Anything else, Corey, for the audience?
This has been a great conversation. Hopefully we can do some more since we're stuck at home anyway from you know, doing the social distancing stuff. So another thing is, yeah, just if you want, you know, we'll share this video later, but if you want to check out more of our stuff, just follow us on Twitter. We share all of our stuff there. My handle is @DeAngelis Corey. Angela's, I believe, is @Angela K. Dills, and then Matthew Nielsen is @Matthew Nielsen if you want to follow us on Twitter. And then Educational Freedom Institute can be found at @EF_Institute. So and then also efinstitute.org, right, is our website. So check us out there.
Great. Thank you, guys. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah. Have a good one.
Okay.